A lonely widow helped an injured dog, unaware it would lead her to a new love and family. The thought would have seemed absurd to Margaret Wilson 6 months ago, when the silence in her cottage on Maple Lane threatened to swallow her whole. Now, as autumn leaves scattered across her front yard like memories she couldn't quite sweep away, she stood at her kitchen window watching the world continue without her. 3 years a widow, 1,095 days without hearing Richard's laugh or feeling his warm hand against the small of her back. 1,095 nights of reaching across empty sheets. Margaret traced a finger along the window's condensation, drawing a line that led nowhere. Outside, the November wind bullied the remaining leaves from their branches, and gray clouds hung low, promising rain. It matched her mood perfectly, the endless, colorless days that bled one into another since Richard had gone. She hadn't planned on being alone at 62. They were supposed to grow old together, travel once he retired, spoil grandchildren they never got to have. Cancer changed everything in 6 short months, leaving Margaret adrift in a life she no longer recognized as her own. The kettle whistled sharply, startling her from her reverie. Tea. Another solitary cup of Earl Grey in a house too quiet, too empty. She moved through the kitchen with the practiced movements of someone who had long ago memorized the choreography of loneliness. Her daughter, Lisa, called every Sunday from Seattle, her voice always tinged with worry that Margaret tried to pretend she didn't notice. "You should get a pet, Mom," Lisa had suggested last week. "A cat, maybe. Something to keep you company." Margaret had dismissed the idea with a soft laugh. "I can barely take care of myself these days, sweetheart." It wasn't entirely untrue. Since Richard's death, Margaret had retreated from nearly everything: the garden club she'd once led, her volunteer work at the library, the friends who eventually stopped calling after too many declined invitations. Her world had narrowed to the walls of the cottage, to grocery trips planned during off hours to avoid running into acquaintances whose pity she couldn't bear. Rain began to tap against the window, first a gentle patter, then a steady drumming. Margaret wrapped her cardigan, Richard's cardigan really, tighter around her slender frame and settled into the worn armchair by the fireplace with her tea and a book she wouldn't actually read. Another day to endure. She must have dozed off, the book splayed open on her lap, when a sound pierced through her dreamless sleep. Not quite a bark, more of a whimper, followed by a scratching at her back door that seemed almost hesitant. Margaret blinked away sleep, disoriented. The clock on the mantel showed just past 4. The rain had intensified, driving hard against the windows. The scratching came again, more insistent this time. "Hello?" she called, immediately feeling foolish for addressing an empty house. Rising stiffly from the chair, she moved toward the kitchen and the back door, her heart quickening despite herself. In 3 years, nothing unexpected had happened in this house. Nothing at all had happened. Through the door's small window, she saw only darkness at first, then movement, low to the ground. Flicking on the porch light, she gasped. A dog. Medium-sized, with matted fur darkened by rain, and something else. Something that looked worryingly like blood. It stood on 3 legs, holding its front right paw awkwardly above the ground, its dark eyes fixed on Margaret with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Oh," she whispered, her hand flying to her throat. "Oh dear." The dog whimpered again, a sound so pitiful it bypassed all Margaret's carefully constructed walls. Without thinking, she unlocked the door, swinging it open against the force of the wind and rain. The animal didn't rush in as she expected. Instead, it stood shivering on her back step, regarding her with what could only be described as caution. Margaret noticed its ribs visible beneath wet fur, the absence of a collar, the way it trembled. From cold or fear or pain, she couldn't tell. "Come on then," she said softly, kneeling with difficulty. Her knees protested the movement, a sharp reminder of her age. "I won't hurt you." The dog took one halting step forward, then another, leaving small, muddy paw prints on her clean kitchen floor. Margaret found she didn't care. When the animal was fully inside, she closed the door against the storm and stood looking at her unexpected visitor, suddenly uncertain. What did one do with an injured stray dog on a rainy November evening? The dog made the decision for her, collapsing onto its side with a soft whine that seemed to empty directly into Margaret's chest, finding the hollow place there and expanding. "All right," she whispered, more to herself than to the dog. "All right." She moved with purpose now, retrieving clean towels from the linen closet, filling a bowl with water, searching the refrigerator for something a dog might eat. She found leftover roast chicken, a meal she'd made 2 days ago and barely touched. As she worked, she felt something unfamiliar stirring in her chest. Not quite panic, not quite excitement. Purpose, perhaps. Kneeling beside the dog, she gently began to dry its fur, revealing a coat that might have been golden under all the dirt. The animal flinched when she neared its injured paw, but made no move to bite or run. "You're being very brave," Margaret told it, surprised by the tenderness in her own voice. How long had it been since she'd spoken to anyone but Lisa with genuine feeling? "Let me see what's happened here." The paw was swollen, with a deep gash across the pad that still oozed blood. No wonder the poor thing couldn't walk on it. Margaret's brow furrowed. "This needs more than I can give you," she said. "You need a veterinarian." The dog responded by resting its head on her knee, those soulful brown eyes never leaving her face. Something cracked inside Margaret's chest, a fissure in the ice that had formed around her heart. "Don't look at me like that," she murmured, her fingers gently stroking behind the dog's ears. "I'm not good company these days." But the storm outside had grown fiercer, rain lashing against the windows like accusations. And it was nearly 5 now. Would a vet even be open? Margaret sighed, reaching for her phone. She had no idea whom to call, but she knew someone who would. "Mrs. Abernathy?" "It's Margaret Wilson from down the lane," she said when her neighbor answered. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I've found an injured dog and I'm not sure what to do." 20 minutes later, wrapped in a raincoat she hadn't worn in months, Margaret carefully lifted the dog into the back seat of her seldom-used Volvo. Mrs. Abernathy had directed her to Riverside Animal Clinic, assuring her they had emergency hours until 7. "His name is Dr. Thomas Kendrick," Mrs. Abernathy had said. "He's new to town, took over when old Dr. Miller retired last year. Very good with animals, very patient." The roads glistened under streetlights, the wipers working furiously against the downpour. In the back seat, the dog lay wrapped in towels, occasionally making small noises that tightened Margaret's grip on the steering wheel. "Almost there," she promised, glancing in the rearview mirror. "Hold on." Riverside Animal Clinic was a small brick building set back from the road, its windows glowing warmly against the gathering darkness. Margaret parked as close to the entrance as possible, then hesitated, looking back at her passenger. "I don't think I can carry you," she admitted. The dog weighed at least 40 pounds, and her back wasn't what it used to be. As if understanding, the animal struggled to its feet, still favoring the injured paw. Together, they made their way through the rain to the clinic's door, Margaret supporting as much of the dog's weight as she could. By the time they stumbled inside, she was breathless and dripping, her silver-streaked hair plastered to her forehead. "I need help," she announced to the young woman behind the reception desk. "This dog is injured. I found it, her, at my back door." The receptionist rose immediately. "Let me get Dr. Kendrick." Moments later, a tall man with salt and pepper hair and glasses appeared, his face creased with immediate concern. "Let's get this one into an exam room," he said, his voice deep and calm. Without waiting for a response, he knelt and gently lifted the dog as if it weighed nothing at all. "This way, please." Margaret followed, suddenly conscious of her disheveled appearance, the oversized raincoat, her sensible shoes splattered with mud, the fact that she hadn't bothered with makeup or even a proper hairstyle in. She couldn't remember how long. The exam room was brightly lit and warm. "Doctor." Kendrick placed the dog on a metal table with surprising gentleness for such a large man. "I'm Thomas Kendrick," he said, offering a smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. He looked to be in his early 60s, with kind eyes behind his glasses and the easy confidence of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. "Margaret Wilson?" she replied, tucking a damp strand of hair behind her ear. Well, the dog found me, really. Showed up at my back door in this storm." "Doctor," Kendrick nodded, turning his attention to his patient. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking vitals, examining the injured paw, running his fingers along the dog's ribs and limbs. "She's a female, probably around 2 years old," he said. "Golden retriever mix, I'd guess. No microchip that I can feel, but we'll scan to be sure. She's undernourished, but not critically so. The main concern is this paw." Margaret found herself leaning forward, invested in the diagnosis. "Is it broken?" "No, thankfully. But there's a deep laceration that needs cleaning and stitching. And she's running a slight fever, which suggests infection. We'll start her on antibiotics." He looked up, meeting Margaret's eyes. "You did the right thing bringing her in, Ms. Wilson." "Mrs." she corrected automatically, then felt foolish. Though I suppose it doesn't matter now. Something in her tone must have communicated more than she intended, because Dr. Kendrick's expression softened. It was kind of you to help her. Many people wouldn't have opened their door. Margaret shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. I couldn't leave her in the rain. The dog whimpered then, pressing her head against Margaret's hand where it rested on the exam table. The gesture was so trusting, so grateful, that Margaret felt her throat tighten unexpectedly. She seems to have chosen you, Dr. Kendrick observed quietly. Oh, I can't, Margaret began, then faltered. I mean, I'm not really in a position to… Dr. Kendrick held up a hand. Let's focus on getting her well first. We'll need to keep her overnight for observation after I treat the paw. After that, we can discuss options, looking for her original owner if she has one, or finding her a new home if needed. Relief and something like disappointment mingled in Margaret's chest. Of course, that makes sense. I'll need to get her into surgery right away, he continued, already gathering supplies. The paperwork can wait until afterward. Feel free to wait in the reception area, or I can call you when we're finished if you'd prefer to go home and dry off. Margaret glanced down at herself, suddenly aware again of her dripping clothes and disheveled state. I'll wait, she decided, surprising herself. If that's all right. Doctor? Kendrick smiled, a warm expression that reached his eyes. Of course. Amy at the front desk can show you where the coffee is. This shouldn't take more than an hour. Before following the receptionist out, Margaret paused, her hand resting briefly on the dog's damp head. You'll be fine, she whispered. You're in good hands now. The waiting area was empty save for Margaret, the storm having kept other pet owners at home. She accepted a steaming cup of coffee from Amy and settled into a chair, suddenly exhausted. When was the last time she'd left her house for anything other than groceries or Lisa's insistent dinner invitations? When was the last time she'd done something unexpected? She sipped her coffee, watching raindrops race down the clinic's windows, and realized with a start that she hadn't thought about her grief once since finding the dog. For a few hours, the weight had lifted, replaced by something else. Concern for another living creature, purpose, movement forward instead of the stagnant pool of remembrance she'd been drowning in. The guilt hit immediately afterward. Was she betraying Richard by feeling something other than loss? By allowing her attention to be diverted, even for an afternoon? He wouldn't think so, she whispered to herself, hearing Richard's voice in her memory. Life is for the living, Maggie girl. She closed her eyes, letting the nickname wash over her. No one called her Maggie anymore. No one knew her well enough to use the name that belonged to a younger, more vibrant version of herself. An hour stretched into nearly 2 before Dr. Kendrick emerged, his scrubs showing traces of the ordeal, but his face relaxed. She did great, he announced, settling into the chair across from Margaret. 12 stitches in the paw, antibiotics on board, and she's resting comfortably now. Thank goodness, Margaret breathed, genuinely relieved. What happens now? We'll keep her overnight for observation, maybe longer depending on how she responds to treatment. I've taken some photos to post online. Sometimes owners are searching for their lost pets. He studied Margaret for a moment. But given her condition, I suspect she's been on her own for a while. Margaret nodded, thinking of the visible ribs, the matted fur. Poor thing. If no owner comes forward, we'll need to find her a home. He hesitated. Have you considered… I can't, Margaret interrupted, more sharply than she intended. She softened her tone. I mean, I live alone. I don't think I'd be good company for a dog. Doctor. Kendrick nodded, not pressing the issue. Well, there's time to think about it. She'll need at least a few days of recovery here. He pulled a business card from his pocket and handed it to her. My direct line. Feel free to call tomorrow for an update or stop by if you'd like to see her. Margaret took the card, running her thumb over the embossed lettering. Thank you, Dr. Kendrick. Thomas, please, he said, standing. And thank you, Mrs. Wilson. Not everyone would have gone to such trouble for a stray. Margaret, she replied, rising as well. And I didn't do anything special, really. His smile suggested he disagreed, but he simply nodded. Drive safely, Margaret. The storm's letting up, but the roads will still be slick. As she drove home through the lessening rain, Margaret felt oddly unsettled. The house, when she entered, seemed different somehow, as if the brief presence of another living creature had altered its very atmosphere. She moved through the rooms, turning on lights, chasing away shadows that had never bothered her before. In the kitchen, the towels she'd used on the dog lay in a damp heap, and muddy paw prints marked a path across the floor. evidence that the afternoon had not been a dream, that something had disrupted the careful isolation she'd constructed. Margaret cleaned the floor, washed the towels, restored order. But as she prepared for bed, she found herself wondering how the dog was doing, if she was afraid in the strange clinic surroundings, if she was in pain. "This is ridiculous," she told her reflection as she brushed her teeth. "It's just a dog, a stray that happened to choose your door." But as she slipped between cool sheets, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, that the dog had brought with her a whisper of change, a reminder that the world continued outside Margaret's carefully constructed fortress of grief. She slept poorly, waking several times from dreams where she was searching for something important, something just beyond her reach. When morning finally came, gray light filtering through the curtains, Margaret found herself reaching for the phone before she'd even made her tea. "Riverside Animal Clinic, how may I help you?" "Hello, this is Margaret Wilson. I brought in a stray dog last evening and Dr. Kendrick Thomas said I could call for an update?" "Of course, Mrs. Wilson. Let me get the doctor for you." A brief wait, then his voice, warm even through the phone line. "Margaret, good morning. I was just checking on our patient." "How is she?" Margaret asked, surprised by her own eagerness. "Doing remarkably well. The fever's down, and she's already putting some weight on the paw, which is an excellent sign. She's also eaten well this morning." "Oh, that's wonderful," Margaret said, relief washing through her. "I was worried." There was a smile in his voice when he replied, "Would you like to come see her today? Visiting hours start at 10. Margaret glanced at the clock, not quite 8. "Yes," she said, the word escaping before she could reconsider. "Yes, I think I would." After hanging up, Margaret stood in the middle of her kitchen, momentarily stunned by her own decision. When was the last time she'd made plans? When was the last time she'd looked forward to anything? She moved with unfamiliar purpose, showering and dressing with care, even applying a touch of lipstick and mascara. It had been so long since she'd bothered that the makeup felt foreign on her face, but she found she didn't mind. The day had dawned clear after the storm, sunlight glinting off raindrops that still clung to branches and leaves. Margaret chose to walk the half-mile to the clinic, needing the movement, the fresh air, the sense of being part of the world again, however tentatively. Several neighbors waved as she passed, surprise evident in their expressions. Margaret realized with a pang how long it had been since she'd been a regular presence in the neighborhood. Mrs. Abernathy actually came to her fence, clearly pleased to see Margaret out and about. "How's the dog?" she called. "On the mend," Margaret replied, slowing her pace. "I'm going to visit her now," Mrs. Abernathy beamed. "Wonderful. Will you keep her, do you think?" The question caught Margaret off guard. "Oh, I don't. That is, I haven't really." "You should consider it," Mrs. Abernathy said gently. "A house needs life in it, Margaret." The words followed her all the way to the clinic, echoing with each step. A house needs life in it. And what about a person? Did a person need life too, after they'd convinced themselves that merely existing was enough? The clinic was busier than it had been the previous evening, the waiting room occupied by several people with carriers or leashed pets. Margaret approached the front desk hesitantly. "I'm here to see, well, I don't know what you're calling her. The golden retriever brought in last night?" "I'm Margaret Wilson." Amy smiled in recognition. "Of course. Dr. Kendrick mentioned you'd be coming by. Follow me." She led Margaret through a door and down a short hallway to a room lined with kennels. Most contained cats or small dogs, but in a larger enclosure at the end lay the golden retriever, her coat noticeably cleaner than it had been the night before. When she saw Margaret, her tail began to thump against the floor of the kennel.
"She remembers you,"
Amy said, unlocking the kennel door. "Dr. Kendrick said you can visit with her in the courtyard if you'd like. It's a beautiful day and she could use some gentle exercise." Margaret nodded, suddenly nervous. How do I? Amy handed her a leash. "Just clip this to her temporary collar. She's very gentle. Dr. Kendrick says she has an excellent temperament, especially considering what she's been through." The dog stood when Margaret approached, her tail wagging harder. The transformation from the pitiful creature on her doorstep was remarkable. Her golden coat gleamed despite still being a bit thin, and her eyes were bright and alert. "Hello there," Margaret said softly, kneeling to clip the leash. "You're looking much better today." The dog pressed her nose into Margaret's hand, then leaned her whole body against Margaret's legs once they were standing. The simple trust of the gesture made Margaret's eyes sting unexpectedly. "The courtyard is just through that door," Amy directed, pointing. Take as long as you like." The courtyard was small but pleasant, with benches, a patch of grass, and several potted plants. Margaret settled on a bench, and the dog immediately lay at her feet, resting her head on Margaret's shoe as if they'd known each other for years instead of hours. "You're very presumptuous," Margaret told her, but she couldn't keep the affection from her voice. She leaned down to stroke the soft ears. "I suppose you think you've found yourself a person, don't you?" The dog sighed contentedly, closing her eyes under Margaret's touch. "I'm not very good company these days," Margaret continued, the words easier to say to a dog than to any human. "I've been stuck, I suppose, since my husband died. Richard," she added, the name feeling both familiar and strange on her tongue after so long speaking it only in the privacy of her thoughts. The dog opened one eye, regarding her solemnly. 3 years is a long time to be stuck," Margaret admitted, more to herself than to the animal at her feet. "I'm not sure I remember how not to be. Sometimes we need a reason to start moving again." Margaret startled, looking up to find Thomas Kendrick standing in the doorway to the courtyard, a stethoscope around his neck and an apologetic expression on his face. "I'm sorry," he said quickly. "I didn't mean to eavesdrop. I just came to check on my patient." Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. "How much did you hear?" "Enough to know you've had a difficult few years," he said simply, crossing to kneel beside the dog. He ran practiced hands over her, checking the bandaged paw, feeling along her sides. "And enough to see that this girl has taken a shine to you." The dog's tail thumped against the ground in agreement, her eyes never leaving Margaret's face even as Thomas examined her. "She's doing remarkably well," he said, straightening. "The infection is responding to the antibiotics, and the stitches are holding nicely." He hesitated. "We've posted her photos online, but so far no one has come forward claiming her." Margaret nodded, unsure what to say. "I'm not trying to pressure you," Thomas added, sitting on the bench beside her. "But I do think you two found each other for a reason." "You believe in that sort of thing?" Margaret asked, surprised. "That things happen for a reason?" Thomas considered this, his expression thoughtful. "I believe that sometimes life offers us exactly what we need, often when we least expect it." He gestured to the dog. "She needed help and you provided it. Perhaps there's something she can give you in return." The words hung in the air between them, not a challenge but an invitation. Margaret looked down at the dog, who gazed back with complete trust. "I don't even know what to call her," Margaret said finally. Thomas smiled, understanding the capitulation in her words. "That's the wonderful thing about naming a pet. You get to choose something that matters to you." Margaret thought for a moment, her fingers gently stroking the dog's soft head. "Hope," she said finally. "I think I'll call her Hope." The name felt right as soon as she said it, a small act of faith, a declaration of possibility. "Hope," Thomas repeated, nodding approval. "It suits her." He reached into his pocket and produced a business card, different from the one he'd given her the night before. "This is the number for my cell phone. If you have any questions about caring for her, day or night, please don't hesitate to call." Their fingers brushed as Margaret took the card, a brief contact that nonetheless sent a flutter of awareness through her. How long had it been since she'd experienced that sensation? Since she'd noticed a man as anything other than a figure passing through the periphery of her narrowed existence? "Thank you," she said, suddenly flustered. "For everything. For helping Hope and for eavesdropping?" he suggested with a self-deprecating smile. Margaret laughed, the sound surprising her. "For seeing something I couldn't yet see myself." Thomas's expression softened. "Hope can go home tomorrow, if her progress continues as expected. We can discuss care instructions then." He stood professional once more. "Take all the time you want out here. The fresh air is good for both of you." After he left, Margaret sat in the sunlit courtyard with Hope's warm weight against her legs, turning the business card over in her fingers. Thomas Kendrick, DVM, and beneath it a handwritten cell number. Such a small thing, and yet it felt monumental. A connection, a possibility, a door cracked open when she'd spent so long with all doors firmly shut. "What do you think, Hope?" she asked softly. "Are we really doing this?" The dog raised her head at the sound of her new name, ears perked forward attentively. "I'll need to get supplies," Margaret continued, thinking aloud. "Food, a bed, bowls. It's been a long time since I've had a reason to shop for anything but groceries." She leaned down, meeting Hope's steady gaze. "You're going to change things, aren't you?" Hope's response was to lick Margaret's hand once, decisively, as if sealing a pact. The following day dawned bright and crisp, November sunlight slanting through Margaret's kitchen windows as she prepared for Hope's homecoming. She'd spent the previous afternoon purchasing supplies, perhaps more than strictly necessary, but there had been something deeply satisfying about choosing a plush dog bed, a variety of toys, premium food recommended by Thomas. She found herself thinking of him as she arranged Hope's bed in the corner of the living room, remembering the warmth in his eyes, the gentleness of his hands as he examined Hope, the way he'd listened without judgment to her inadvertent confession in the courtyard. "Stop it," she told herself firmly. "You're acting like a schoolgirl." But the thought persisted as she drove to the clinic, a small flutter of anticipation that had nothing to do with bringing Hope home and everything to do with seeing Thomas Kendrick again. The clinic was quieter today, only one other client in the waiting room when Margaret arrived. Amy greeted her with a smile. "She's all ready to go," she said. "Doctor, Kendrick is just finishing up with another patient, but he wanted to go over care instructions with you personally." Margaret nodded, trying to ignore the way her pulse quickened at this news. "Of course, I'm happy to wait." She didn't have to wait long. Thomas appeared a few minutes later, his face lighting with a smile when he saw her. "Margaret, good morning. Hope's been waiting for you. I think she knows she's going home today." Home. The word resonated strangely in Margaret's chest. For so long, her house had been a place of memories, of echoes, of absence. Could it be a home again? Thomas led her to an exam room where Hope waited, already wearing a proper collar with a temporary tag. The dog's entire body wiggled with joy when she saw Margaret, her tail a golden blur of happiness. "Someone's excited," Thomas observed, his voice warm with approval. "Let me show you how to care for the wound." He demonstrated how to clean the stitches and apply the antibiotic ointment, his fingers brushing against Margaret's as he guided her through the process. Each contact sent a small shiver through her, a reminder of nerves long dormant. "The stitches can come out in about 10 days, he explained. "She should limit activity for the first week, short walks only, no running or jumping." Margaret nodded, trying to focus on his instructions rather than the timbre of his voice or the way his glasses slipped slightly down his nose as he bent to check Hope's paw one final time. "She'll need to finish this course of antibiotics," he continued, handing Margaret a bottle of pills, "one in the morning and one in the evening with food. I've made a list," Margaret admitted, pulling a small notebook from her purse. "I didn't want to forget anything." Thomas smiled, a genuine expression that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "That's excellent. Do you have any questions for me?" A dozen questions hovered on Margaret's tongue, but none of them had to do with Hope's care. Instead, she asked, "Will you check on her progress? I mean, should I bring her back before the stitches come out?" "Definitely. Let's say 3 days from now, just to make sure the infection is completely cleared." He hesitated, then added, "Or you can call if you have any concerns before then. Day or night." There it was again, that extension of connection beyond the professional relationship, a small bridge offered across the chasm of Margaret's isolation. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything." Thomas held her gaze for a moment longer than strictly necessary. "It's my pleasure, Margaret. Truly." As she drove home with Hope sitting regally in the passenger seat, Margaret felt a lightness she hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't happiness exactly, not yet, but perhaps its precursor. Possibility. The sense that the story wasn't over, that new chapters remained to be written. Hope settled into Margaret's home with surprising ease, as if she'd always belonged there. That first night, Margaret expected her to sleep in the plush bed she'd purchased, but when she went to her bedroom, Hope followed, jumping carefully onto the foot of the bed and looking at Margaret with an expression that clearly asked permission. "I suppose it's your home now, too," Margaret said, patting the coverlet. Hope curled up with a contented sigh, and for the first time in 3 years, Margaret fell asleep to the sound of another living being's breathing. The days fell into a new rhythm. Morning walks, short and gentle as Thomas had instructed, mealtimes, afternoon reading with Hope's head in her lap, evening television with the dog warm against her side. Simple routines, but they anchored Margaret to the present in a way she hadn't been for years. Neighbors who had long ago stopped trying to engage with her now paused during their own walks, drawn by Hope's friendly demeanor. "Beautiful dog," Mr. Jenkins from 2 doors down commented. "Had a golden myself years ago. Best dog I ever owned. She found me, actually," Margaret heard herself explaining. "Showed up at my door in that big storm last week. Lucky for both of you," Mr. Jenkins said with a knowing nod. And it was lucky, Margaret realized. Lucky that Hope had chosen her door, lucky that Mrs. Abernathy had known about Riverside Animal Clinic, lucky that Thomas Kendrick had been the veterinarian on duty that night. Thomas. She couldn't seem to stop thinking about him, remembering the warmth of his smile, the steadiness of his hands, the way he'd seen through her defenses with such gentle insight. When the day came for Hope's follow-up appointment, Margaret found herself changing outfits twice before settling on a blue sweater that Lisa had once told her brought out her eyes. She even applied mascara and a touch of blush, then stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror. "What are you doing, Maggie?" she asked herself softly. Hope appeared in the doorway, head tilted questioningly. "It's nothing," Margaret told her, smoothing her hair. "Just being silly. Come on, let's not keep the doctor waiting." Thomas's face brightened visibly when he saw them enter the exam room, and Margaret felt a corresponding warmth spread through her chest. "Look at you two," he said, kneeling to greet Hope, who promptly covered his face with enthusiastic kisses. "I'd say someone's settling in well." "She's a perfect houseguest," Margaret agreed, though she seems to think the sofa was purchased specifically for her comfort. Thomas laughed, a rich sound that Margaret found herself wanting to hear again. "Golden retrievers are notorious furniture dogs. They think they're people." "She sleeps on my bed," Margaret admitted. "I know I probably shouldn't allow it, but it's nice not to sleep alone," Thomas finished softly, rising to his feet. Their eyes met, and Margaret saw understanding there, not pity, but genuine comprehension. "Yes," she said simply. "It is." Something shifted in the air between them, a current of connection that had nothing to do with Hope's care. Thomas cleared his throat, breaking the moment. "Let's check that paw, shall we?" The examination was thorough but quick. Hope's wound was healing beautifully, the infection completely gone. "She's doing wonderfully," Thomas declared. "You're taking excellent care of her." "She makes it easy," Margaret replied. "She's very patient with me." Thomas nodded, understanding the deeper meaning behind her words. Animals often are. They live completely in the present, no regrets about the past, no anxiety about the future. It's a gift they give us, that reminder to be here now. The words resonated with Margaret, who had spent the last 3 years living almost exclusively in the past. Hope had indeed drawn her into the present, hour by hour, day by day. "The stitches can come out in about a week," Thomas continued. "You can schedule that at the front desk, or—" He hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. "Or I could remove them at your home, if that would be easier for Hope. Some dogs get anxious at the clinic." Margaret blinked, surprised by the offer. "Would you really do that?" "Of course," Thomas said, his tone casual, though his eyes held something more. "It's a simple procedure. I make house calls for some of my elderly clients or for animals that don't travel well. Hope seems to travel just fine," Margaret noted, glancing at the dog, who was contentedly exploring the exam room. Thomas smiled, a touch of self-consciousness in the expression. "Perhaps I'm just looking for an excuse to see how she's doing in her new home, then." The admission hung in the air between them, an invitation that extended beyond professional courtesy. "I think we'd both like that," Margaret said finally, surprising herself with her boldness. Thomas's smile widened. "Excellent. Why don't you give me your address and we can set a time?" As Margaret wrote her address in Thomas's appointment book, though she suspected he already knew where she lived, given Mrs. Abernathy's involvement, she felt a flutter of anticipation in her chest. Not quite nervousness, not quite excitement, but a blend of both that felt startlingly like being alive. The days until Thomas's visit passed quickly, filled with Hope's recovery and a growing sense of revival in Margaret's own life. She found herself opening curtains that had remained drawn for months, playing music that had gone unheard since Richard's death, even tending to the garden that had fallen into neglect. "What do you think?" she asked Hope on the morning of Thomas's visit, surveying the freshly vacuumed living room and the vase of late autumn flowers she'd cut from the garden. "Too obvious?" Hope, sprawled on the sofa that had indeed become her domain, thumped her tail against the cushions. "You're right," Margaret sighed, moving the flowers from the coffee table to the kitchen counter. Completely transparent, and yet she couldn't bring herself to undo the other small preparations she'd made, the plate of homemade cookies cooling on the rack, the first time she'd baked in years, the coffee ready to brew, the care she'd taken with her appearance. Thomas arrived precisely at the appointed time, a small medical bag in hand and a warm smile on his face. "You're looking well," he said as Margaret showed him in, his eyes taking in the blue sweater she'd chosen again and the pearl earrings she'd unearthed from her jewelry box. Both of you," he added as Hope bounded up, mindful of her healing paw but unable to contain her excitement. "She's been watching for you all morning," Margaret said, not admitting that she, too, had found herself glancing repeatedly out the window. "Please come in. Would you like coffee? Or tea?" "I have both." "Coffee would be wonderful," Thomas replied, following her to the kitchen. "Your home is lovely." Margaret glanced around the cottage, seeing it through his eyes. The bookshelves lining the living room walls, the comfortable furniture, the photographs she'd recently brought out of drawers where they'd been hidden away, unable to bear the sight of happier times. "Thank you. It's been coming back to life lately." She busied herself with the coffee maker, suddenly shy. "Hope has been good for the place." "And for you?" Thomas asked gently. Margaret turned to face him, coffee forgotten. "Yes," she admitted. "For me too." Thomas nodded, his expression understanding. "I'm glad. When I first saw you that night in the clinic, you reminded me of myself after my wife died." The revelation caught Margaret off guard. "Your wife?" "Eleanor," he said, the name clearly precious to him. "Cancer 5 years ago. We'd been married 30 years. I'm so sorry," Margaret whispered, recognition and empathy flooding through her. "Richard, my husband, it was cancer too. 3 years ago." Thomas nodded. "Mrs. Abernathy mentioned it when I called her after your first visit to ask about you." "You called to ask about me?" Margaret wasn't sure whether to be touched or embarrassed. Thomas smiled, a hint of sheepishness in the expression. "I wanted to know more about the woman who'd braved a storm to help a stray dog. It intrigued me." The coffee maker beeped, saving Margaret from having to respond immediately. She poured 2 cups, grateful for the momentary distraction. "Shall we check on Hope's stitches?" Thomas suggested, accepting the mug she offered. "And then perhaps we can talk more." The procedure was quick and painless. Hope lay patiently on her side on a blanket Margaret had spread on the living room floor, barely flinching as Thomas carefully removed the stitches. "She's healed beautifully," he declared, gently examining the paw. "You'd hardly know she was injured." He stroked Hope's head affectionately. "You're a very lucky girl, finding someone like Margaret to take care of you." Hope's tail thumped in agreement, and Margaret felt a swell of pride. "We take care of each other," she said quietly. Thomas looked up, meeting her eyes. "The best relationships usually work that way." They moved to the sofa afterward, Hope settling between them as they sipped coffee and shared the cookies Margaret had baked. The conversation flowed with surprising ease about their respective careers. Thomas's 3 decades as a veterinarian, Margaret's years as a librarian before her retirement, about their grown children, his son in California, her daughter in Seattle, about the grief they'd both navigated. "The second year was the hardest for me," Thomas admitted. "The first year, you're in shock, just surviving day to day. But the second year, you start to realize this is your life now, and you have to decide what to do with it." Margaret nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. "I think I'm still deciding," she said softly. "Or maybe just starting to." Thomas's hand found hers where it rested on Hope's back, a gentle touch that sent warmth spreading up Margaret's arm. "It takes time," he said, "and it's different for everyone. But eventually, you start to remember that you're still here, still alive." The word hung in the air between them. Alive. Yes, that was what Margaret had begun to feel again. The stirring of life, the possibility of joy, the recognition that her heart, while scarred, still beat with purpose. "Would you like to stay for lunch?" she asked suddenly. "I made soup this morning. Nothing fancy, but I'd love to," Thomas replied, his smile lighting his eyes behind his glasses. "If Hope doesn't mind sharing you." Hope raised her head at the sound of her name, looking between them with what Margaret could have sworn was approval. Lunch extended into a walk around the neighborhood, Hope proudly leading the way, her paw now strong enough for moderate exercise. Margaret and Thomas strolled side by side, occasionally brushing shoulders, talking about everything and nothing, favorite books, the changing seasons, the best places to walk dogs in town. "There's a wonderful trail along the river," Thomas mentioned. "Very peaceful, especially early in the morning. Hope would love it once she's fully healed." "You'll have to show us sometime," Margaret said, the invitation easier to extend than she would have believed possible a few weeks ago. Thomas's smile was answer enough. As autumn deepened toward winter, Thomas became a regular presence in Margaret's life. Weekend walks along the river, impromptu dinners, evenings spent by the fireplace with Hope sprawled at their feet. With each meeting, Margaret felt another piece of her frozen heart thaw, another wall crumble. "You seem different, Mom." Lisa observed during their weekly Sunday call. "Happier, do I?" Margaret asked, watching through the window as Thomas and Hope played fetch in the backyard, his laughter carrying through the glass. "Definitely. It's the dog, isn't it? I knew a pet would be good for you." Margaret smiled, not yet ready to share the full story. "Hope has certainly changed things, but it's not just her." There was a pause on the line, then Lisa's voice, hopeful and hesitant. "Mom? Is there someone new in your life?" Margaret watched as Thomas knelt to ruffle Hope's ears, his face alight with affection. "Not new exactly," she said carefully, "but someone who understands the journey, someone who knows what it's like to lose and begin again." Lisa's joy was palpable even through the phone. "Oh, Mom, Dad would be so happy for you." The words brought unexpected tears to Margaret's eyes. "Do you really think so?" "I know so," Lisa said firmly. "He always said he wanted you to be happy no matter what. Remember?" Margaret did remember those final weeks when Richard, though in pain, had been most concerned about how she would manage without him. "Life is for the living, Maggie girl," he'd told her. "Promise me you'll keep living it." A promise she had broken until now. When Thomas came inside, cheeks ruddy from the cold, hope bounding ahead of him, Margaret met him with a certainty she hadn't felt in years. "I'd like you to meet my daughter," she said, "when she comes for Christmas. If you want to, that is." Thomas's smile was like sunrise after the longest night. "I'd be honored," he said, taking her hands in his. "And perhaps you might meet my son when he visits for New Year's." Margaret nodded, a future unfolding before her that she hadn't dared imagine. "I'd like that very much." That evening, as snow began to fall outside the cottage windows, Margaret sat on the sofa between the two beings who had brought her back to life. Hope with her head on Margaret's lap, and Thomas with his arm around her shoulders, his heartbeat steady and sure against her side. "I never expected this," she admitted softly. "Any of it." Thomas pressed a gentle kiss to her temple. "The best gifts are often the ones we never knew to ask for." Hope sighed contentedly in agreement, and Margaret felt, for the first time in 3 years, completely at home in her own life, in her own heart. The lonely widow who had helped an injured dog, unaware it would lead her to a new love and family, now understood that sometimes the greatest acts of courage are the smallest ones. Opening a door during a storm, saying yes to connection, allowing joy to return after loss. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the world in possibility, in second chances, in the promise of beginnings disguised as endings. And inside, in the warm circle of light, 3 hearts beat in harmony, each having found in the others exactly what they needed most, not the absence of loss, but the presence of love strong enough to hold it, to honor it, and ultimately to transform it into something new and beautiful and very much alive.